You call yourself you, but who exactly is that? Neuroscience tells us that the self is not a fixed entity, but a process, an ongoing construction of the brain. Split brain experiments revealed something startling. When the two hemispheres of the brain were severed, each half developed its own perception, its own will. Which one was the real person? Both? Neither? Psychology adds another layer. Every memory you hold, every story you tell about yourself, is edited each time you recall it. In truth, the past you cling to is not history, it is imagination. And philosophy has always suspected this. In Buddhist thought, the self is an illusion, a fleeting bundle of perceptions without a core. David Hume said he searched within and found only a stream of impressions, never a solid I. So what are you? A body? A brain? A narrative? Or something else entirely? Imagine a river. You can point to it and call it a single thing. But in truth, it is never the same river, not even for a moment. Water flows in, water flows out. It appears stable, yet it is always changing. Perhaps the self is the same. What you call you is not a thing, but a movement, temporary, fragile, and never quite the same from one heartbeat to the next. Then the unsettling question arises. If the self is an illusion, who is it? Exactly, that is asking the question. What if I told you that everything you think you are, every memory, every preference, every quiet inner voice that answers in the dark, is no more than a temporary arrangement of processes, a passing choreography of neurons and stories, not a thing that endures, but a scene that keeps replaying. Not a who, but a happening. We call ourselves by a name. We point to a biography. Childhood, adolescent turning points, career, relationships. We stitch together a timeline and sign it with the pronoun I. But the closer we look at that stitching, the looser it becomes. The seams show. Threads that felt invisible are suddenly visible. Modern neuroscience offers a disquieting observation. The brain constructs the self. It binds perceptions, memories, bodily sensations, and evaluations into a coherent sense of being. This coherence feels effortless. It feels undeniable. Yet under the surface, the brain is a marketplace of competing signals, a coalition that temporarily agrees to call itself me. Consider the split-brain patients studied by Roger Sperry and later by Michael Gazzaniga. When the connection between the two cerebral hemispheres is severed, something remarkable and terrifying happens. Each hemisphere can act with its own preferences, its own intentions. In some tasks, one hand will reach for an object and the other will pull it away, as if two minds were sharing a single body. Questions arise. Who is the agent? Which hemisphere is the I? The experiments forced neuroscientists and philosophers to admit what many traditions had already suspected. The unitary self may be a fragile, emergent illusion. If our sense of being a single, continuous self can be split by a surgical cut, then perhaps unity is not primitive. Perhaps it is a performance the brain mounts to keep the organism adaptive. The performance works most of the time. A predictable narrative helps us move through the world, learn cause and effect, maintain relationships. But effectiveness is not ontological truth. It is an evolutionary convenience. Memory is commonly mistaken for an archive. We assume that memories are fixed photographs stored in a drawer, to be pulled out unchanged whenever we wish. Yet memory is not a filing cabinet. It is a theater. Every act of recollection is also an act of reconstruction. Laboratory work shows that when a memory is reactivated, it enters an unstable state and must be reconsolidated. During that window, the memory can be altered, weakened, strengthened, or blended with other traces. This is not a marginal effect. It is a fundamental property of how memory works. The implication is stark. The past we remember is not identical to the past that occurred. What we call my history is rewritten each time we speak it, each time we think it. Think of a conversation you had this morning about your childhood. Did you describe events exactly as they happened? Or did the telling emphasize some details, omit others, place causes where later you would place them differently? Over time, repeated telling smooths the rough edges, fills in gaps, and converts fragments into a plausible narrative. The narrative feels continuous, but continuity is the product of editing. we are susceptible to suggestion. Classic experiments by Elizabeth Loftus and others show that false information, even subtle wording differences, can implant memories of events that never occurred. People can confidently remember details that never happened, faces, actions, even crimes, if the right cues are introduced. The malleability of memory reaches beyond misremembered dates. It challenges the very claim that our autobiographical past anchors our identity. When our past is plastic, the self that depends on it is plastic as well. We might believe we are anchored by memory, but our anchor is forged from soft clay. In an age of manipulated images and persuasive narratives, this softness becomes even more consequential. The stories we hold about ourselves are vulnerable to external shaping and internal re-editing. This is not merely an abstract philosophical worry. Legal systems convict on eyewitness testimony. Relationships fracture because of remembered slights. Entire nations build mythologies on collective recollections. If memory is porous, then many of the moral certainties that depend on recollection are built on shifting ground. Psychology offers a flattering story about the self. It is the narrator, the one who integrates experience into meaningful plot lines. This narrator selects, emphasizes, and interprets. It gives coherence to chance and intention to accident. Through narrative, trauma becomes a lesson, loss becomes a turning point, survival becomes meaning. But narrative is not neutral. In fitting our lives into plots, we omit contradictions, erase ambiguities, and compose explanations that reassure. Narrative grants identity its texture, but it also imposes a shape that may misrepresent the complex reality beneath. The metaphors we choose, the river, the theater, the author, each point to an aspect of our condition. None of them capture it wholly. The self is simultaneously storyteller, stage, and audience. None of these roles are permanent. Ask yourself, when you describe who you are, whose story are you trying to tell? Your own? Someone else's? An idealized version? Often, the answer is a layered mixture. Centuries before modern neuroscience, philosophers were already skeptical. David Hume observed that when he probed his own interior, he found nothing that persisted except a stream of perceptions, impressions, and ideas, flowing one after another. He concluded that the self was a bundle, a collection of fleeting perceptions without a core. The thought is simple and disquieting. Look for the I, and you only ever find a perception, never a persisting entity to which the perception belongs. Buddhist traditions, too, articulate a radical thesis: anatta, or no self. The idea is not merely metaphysical denial, it is an ethical and practical diagnosis. Clinging to a durable self, the teachings argue, is the root of suffering because it generates desire, aversion, and a fundamental sense of lack. Let go of the fiction of a permanent self, not in order to annihilate oneself, but to loosen the grip that produces suffering. These philosophical traditions converge with modern empirical observations. What we take to be a stable, autonomous self dissolves under close inquiry. The self is not a simple object waiting to be found. It is a pattern, an emergent process. If we accept the bundle idea that the I is a temporary weave of sensations, thoughts, and memories, then moral responsibility, love, praise, blame, and grief all remain meaningful, but their metaphysical basis changes. They are practices enacted within a flow, not deposits in an unchanging vault. When the brain is at rest, not focused on external tasks but wandering, certain regions reliably become active together. Neuroscientists call this the default mode network. It lights up when we imagine the future, recall the past, or think about ourselves. The DMN seems to host the internal monologue, the autobiographical reflection that stitches experience into narrative. This network does not produce a soul. It produces self-referential processing. Its activation correlates with rumination, self-consciousness, and the rehearsal of identity. When the DMN is overactive, some people become stuck in repetitive narratives of failure or fear. When it is underactive, aspects of self-referential thought can diminish. The biological reality of the DMN shows us that the self has a neural architecture, not to make a metaphysical claim about its essence, but to reveal the machinery by which selfhood is assembled. The self, then, is both biological and narrative. a story performed on a biological stage. Once you see the neural scaffolding, the romantic idea that you are a mysterious immaterial entity becomes harder to sustain. That idea is emotionally compelling because it promises continuity and meaning. Yet the neural view explains continuity as stability of process, not persistence of substance. We have used metaphors throughout, and for good reason. Metaphors are cognitive tools that help us make sense of paradox. The river, it looks one and continuous, yet it is never the same water twice. The theater, the stage contains actors who play roles. The scripts change, but the production continues. The mirror, it reflects a face, but the mirror itself is not the face. These images help us reconcile two truths that superficially contradict: that we are highly predictable creatures with stable identities, and that those identities are mutable, constructed, and transient. The bridge between these truths is process. Stable patterns can arise within fluid systems. If you imagine yourself as a river, the anxiety of permanence softens. You are not lost by being changeable. You are alive precisely because you flow. If the self is constructed, what follows for ethics, responsibility, and meaning? Do we become less accountable because the I that did wrong was always in flux? Hardly. Construction is not randomness. The processes that make the self are shaped by genetics, environment, choices, and institutions, but they nonetheless produce consistent tendencies. Responsibility becomes a matter of tending processes, of shaping conditions so that emergent selves act in humane ways. Philosophically, a constructed self invites humility. When we see our convictions as products of particular histories and not infallible truths, we become less quick to demonize others. Psychologically, the idea offers leverage. If the self is malleable, then so are patterns of reaction, and with patient, deliberate practice, people can change harmful habits. But there is a darker edge, too. If the self is fragile, it can be manipulated. Propaganda, persuasive technologies, and social pressures do not simply influence transient opinions. They can reconfigure the narrative scaffolds that constitute who we are. The same plasticity that allows healing also allows exploitation. This doubling of liberation and vulnerability is the central ethical challenge of our time. There is an ancient story that illustrates the point better than many modern arguments. The Indian sage Nagasena was once asked by a king, "Who are you?" Nagasena replied by pointing to a chariot. He asked how one would call a chariot. The wheels? The axle? The platform? The name chariot refers to an arrangement of parts. There is no separate thing called chariot beyond the parts and their relations. Apply that to the person. The body, sensations, perceptions, memories, and dispositions are the parts. The word person is a convenient label for an arrangement that, when functioning together in a certain way, we call a self. The parable does not deny that living beings act, suffer, and flourish. Rather, it dissolves the illusion of a metaphysical thing behind the activity. Stories like this are not mere curiosities. They are practical mirrors designed to loosen attachment to the idea of a solid, unchanging self. When we can see the self as a process, we gain a new kind of freedom, not cosmic immortality, but the freedom to change how we participate in the world. Close your eyes for a moment and notice the thoughts that arise. Perhaps a memory surfaces, a judgment about someone else, an anticipating fear. Notice the tone, sometimes commanding, sometimes casual. There is often a background commentary that seems to own the whole show. Where does ownership come from? Neuroscience suggests that many of these inner processes are modular. One circuit evaluates, another narrates, another calculates. Ownership is an attribution, a decision that certain signals belong to the agent. But that decision itself is produced by processes. Ownership, then, is a pattern of attribution, not an inexplicable fiat. This naturalistic account does not make experience less vivid. It simply reorients our sense of where agency arises. In practical terms, it gives us cognitive tools. We can learn to notice the voices without being entirely ruled by them. Mindfulness traditions have long taught this attention. Modern cognitive therapies formalize it. Both approaches leverage the plasticity of mind to change the patterns that shape the self. Witnessing is not emptiness. It is a skilled kind of perception, a way to see the construction without being swallowed by it. If the self is a process, what does death mean? Some find this view bleak. If there is no enduring core, then what survives? Others find a strange consolation. If identity is not a small, private jewel but a pattern of relations, then the influence you have on others, the habits you leave, the stories you told, the small acts of care, becomes the real continuity. Death, on this view, is not the loss of a private substance but the cessation of a particular pattern. The pattern had meaning in the interval of its functioning. Meaning need not depend on metaphysical persistence. The river's significance is not in remaining identical. It is in the life it sustains while it flows. If this sits uneasily with you, notice the emotion. It is attachment, fear of disappearance. That fear is understandable. It is also the source of a great moral energy, the desire to make one's life count. Recognizing the constructed self does not extinguish that desire. It refines it. So how do we live, given these discoveries? There are several practical stances that follow naturally. 1. Cultivate perspective. If the self is narrative, then rewriting is possible. Psychotherapy, meditation, and deliberate practice are technologies for story revision. They do not conjure a new ghost. They change the flow of processes, smoothing rough edges and weakening destructive loops. 2. Design supportive environments. Because the self is shaped by context, changing habit requires changing the conditions that reinforce it. Social relationships, institutions, laws, and physical spaces all scaffold identity. If you want different outcomes, change the scaffolding. 3. Practice ethical humility. If you know that your judgments are produced by particular histories, it becomes easier to treat others with curiosity. This does not excuse harm, but it moderates the rush to moral annihilation. 4. Engage with your transience as a source of creativity. If you are a process, then reinvention is possible. The knowledge of fragility can be liberating. It says, you can become different. You need not be trapped by earlier scripts. These are not platitudes. They are practical inferences from a view that takes both science and philosophy seriously. There is a darker lesson we must not ignore. When memory, identity, and narrative are plastic, power can coerce those processes. Advertising, political persuasion, and algorithmic curation are not neutral. They can reconfigure the narratives that give people agency. Societies that understand how selves are constructed have the capacity to influence whole populations, for good or ill. Thus, knowledge of the fragility of the self comes with responsibility. To know that identity is malleable is to know the means for shaping it. That knowledge must be stewarded by ethical reflection, not proprietary advantage. We live in an era where attention itself has become a commodity. The stories we tell about ourselves are at risk of becoming products. Resist the commodification of narrative. Protect the spaces in which personal meaning is formed. Philosophers have proposed strange hypothetical scenarios to test our intuitions. Imagine perfectly that your brain could be scanned and replicated, every synapse, every molecular state, and that an exact copy could be instantiated elsewhere. Would the copy be you? Would continuity require physical continuity? Or is pattern identity enough? These thought experiments expose our mixed intuitions. We want to say both that continuity matters and that pattern matters. Perhaps neither captures the full truth. If the self is a process, then identity ties to continuity of causal history, to relations, to the web of social attachments. The copy might think it is you, but you would still feel singular because your pattern's causal trajectory would remain unique. What these puzzles do best is humble us. They show that deeply held intuitions about who we are often underwritten by unexamined metaphors. The important point is not resolving every metaphysical puzzle. It is using them to loosen rigid attachments so we can act more wisely. If the self is fragile, we might react in two ways: terror or curiosity. Terror clings. It fortifies identity against any evidence of change. Curiosity leans in. It learns the architecture of the mind and uses that knowledge with care. This series will not promise easy answers. It will ask you, again and again, to look beneath the surfaces you take for granted. The aim is not to dissolve you into nihilism, but to show how much opportunity is contained in the fact that the self is a process for compassion, for transformation, and for discerning resistance to manipulation. Before you step back into the world, do a small practice. Observe one memory. Take one image of your past, nothing monumental, perhaps a brief scene from childhood, and notice how it feels to hold it. Tell it once aloud. Then tell it again with a new emphasis or a new cause. Notice how the story shifts. Notice who speaks for you in the telling. You are not being asked to relinquish meaning. You are invited to see meaning as living, not as property. You are being offered a lens. If the self is a scene, then you are both audience and co-author. The question that will follow us through this series is simple and unresolvable. If the self is an arrangement, what arrangements shall we cultivate? Not what shall we deny, but what shall we create? When you are ready, we will continue into memory, time, free will, and the subtle alchemy by which small practices shape the person you become. For now, keep the question with you. Who is it that asks, and what will that asker become? If the self is not solid but a process, then the question arises, what keeps the process together? The answer most of us give is time. We say, I was that child. I am this adult. I will be that old man or woman one day. Time appears to tie the fragments of self into a single thread. But if we look more closely, time itself begins to unravel. Psychologists distinguish between chronological time, the ticking of the clock, and psychological time, the way we experience duration. You've felt this distortion. A single afternoon can stretch endlessly when you're bored, but vanish in a moment when you're absorbed. Entire years of routine blur together, while a few seconds of crisis feel eternal. This reveals something startling. The self in time is not anchored to the clock but to experience. The brain measures time not in seconds but in change, in novelty, in contrast. If little changes, time collapses. If much changes, time expands. So, when you look back at your life, you are not recalling a continuous film. You are holding scattered scenes, stitched into a narrative that pretends to be a film. The self that feels continuous is in fact episodic, fragile, and largely imagined. If memory is porous and time is elastic, then what exactly is the thread that ties you to your past self? Philosopher Parfit posed a haunting puzzle. Imagine you step into a teleporter. It scans your body, destroys you, and rebuilds an exact copy on Mars. The copy remembers your childhood, loves your friends, and feels like you, but your body on Earth is gone. Did you survive? If you think yes, then identity is just continuity of psychological pattern. If you think no, then memories and personality are not enough. There must be something else that persists. But what is that something? A soul? A secret essence? Or is it nothing more than the illusion of unbroken time? Parfit's conclusion was radical. The self is not what matters. What matters are the relations of memory, intention, and character that persist, even if they do not belong to a permanent subject. The I dissolves, but the pattern continues. Neuroscience complicates this further. Regions like the hippocampus don't just store memories. They simulate futures. The same circuits light up when you recall the past and when you imagine what hasn't happened yet. This means the self is not only built on memories but also on predictions. You are, in some sense, as much your imagined futures as your remembered pasts. But if that's true, then the self is stretched across possibilities that never occur. You are partly made of unrealized futures, of ghosts of choices you never made. How much of you exists only in what might have been? Time also forces us to confront death. If the self is a process tied together by psychological time, then death is not the shattering of a solid object, but the cessation of a process. It is like a flame going out, not the destruction of a thing, but the ending of a movement. Yet this is where the deepest unease lies. We want the self to last beyond time, to escape the process. But perhaps that desire itself is part of the illusion, the brain's survival machinery extended beyond biology into metaphysics. Buddhism calls this clinging, the refusal to accept impermanence. Modern psychology echoes this in terror management theory, the idea that much of human culture, from religion to art to war, is an elaborate attempt to deny mortality, to pretend that the self will persist. But what if the opposite is true? What if meaning arises because the self is temporary? If you were eternal, perhaps nothing would matter. It is the very fragility of time, the shortness of the river, that gives urgency to love, to art, to kindness. In Tibetan Buddhist practice, monks spend days or weeks creating intricate mandalas from colored sand, each grain placed with exquisite precision. And when the mandala is complete, when it glows with sacred symmetry, they sweep it away. The point is not destruction. The point is to embody impermanence. Beauty is real, devotion is real, but permanence is illusion. The self, too, may be like the mandala, a careful construction, vivid for a time, destined to dissolve. Its impermanence does not erase its meaning. It gives it weight. What would it mean to see your life this way? Not as something that needs to last forever, but as something meaningful because it won't. So we return to the question, if the self is fragile, memory porous, and time elastic, then what are we? A process unfolding in the moment, a pattern of stories held together by expectation, a mandala of sand, beautiful in its arrangement, vanishing as soon as the wind arrives. Perhaps there is no final answer. Perhaps the point is not to solve the puzzle of self and time, but to live inside it, carefully, curiously, aware that what feels solid is already slipping through our fingers. And maybe that awareness is not despair. Maybe it is freedom. Imagine sitting in a room with the lights low and the hours thin, listening to the slow tick that seems to be the only honest measure left. You could reach for all the familiar anchors, memories, titles, claims of what you like and how you were raised, and set them in front of you like objects on a table. Each one will feel solid at first. A photograph of a face, the name of a school, the taste of a season. But after a while, handling them with care reveals the thinness beneath the image. The photograph is a print from a negative that no longer exists. The school is a cluster of rooms and gestures. The taste of the season is a compound of smell and hunger that your body reconstructs. You begin to see that what you called you was a cluster of affordances, a pattern of responses, a contingent weave of causes and chances played through time. Ask yourself how often you have felt certain, not simply confident in a judgment, but anchored in the belief that you are a single, continuous subject watching a life unfold. That conviction feels like a fact, so obvious that questioning it feels almost rude, like suggesting the table is an illusion while someone else is trying to eat. Yet the case for fragility is not metaphysical fancy. It is woven through the experiments and practices that study mind and memory. When the brain is split, when the narrative is probed, when memories are reshaped by suggestion, the apparent unity loosens. The unity is not a brick at the foundation of being. It is a knot tied by processes that evolved to make behavior simpler and survival more probable. The knot serves its purpose, but it need not be confused with an eternal design. Thinking like this does not strip the world of texture. On the contrary, it sharpens details that previously hid in the glow of confidence. When you realize that memory is reconstructive, you notice the small edits you make to your past, the self-serving emphasis, the omission of pitying moments, the smoothing of shame into lessons. When you realize that anticipation is a form of memory projected forward, you see how much of your present tense is colored by rehearsals of futures that never arrive. Your plans, the private monologues that loop beneath your awareness, are composed of simulations, possibilities given weight and shape by prediction mechanisms in your brain. You are not only the sum of recalled scenes. You are also the living archive of all the ways you imagine yourself responding tomorrow. Much of who you feel you are exists in strings of potentialities that never crystallize, lives that you almost lived and then did not. Consider the strange intimacy of being told a story about yourself by someone close. They recount an episode from your life with vividness and conviction. You listen and you feel that you remember it, even if you do not. Sometimes the impression of memory arrives as if by osmosis. The telling supplies textures you did not recall until they were named. This is not mere mistaken kindness. It reveals the porous boundary between self and other, between private narrative and social scaffolding. Your history is not an internal archive sequestered behind a skull. It is a social artifact that gains form in the presence of witnesses, conversational partners, and cultural frameworks. The self is social because the stories that sustain it require listeners. And yet, the social nature of the self has a darker face. If the self is constructed in conversation, then power speaks into identity. Institutions, markets, algorithms, each provides narratives that people incorporate, sometimes without noticing. The seller who knows how to harness regret, the platform designed to amplify outrage, the political rhetoric that simplifies complex lives into a villain and a victim, these are not just communications. They are forces that shape the scaffolding of selves. Plasticity that enables healing also enables manipulation. A mind that can be persuaded into resilience can be persuaded into rage. The malleability that permits therapy's gentle reweaving can also permit the coarse rewiring affected by targeted persuasion and design choices optimized for engagement rather than truth. To understand the self as process is to admit its ethical vulnerability. There is an ancient discomfort in asking what remains when the apparent core dissolves. We crave metaphysical continuity. We want an answer that hands us a pebble-labeled identity we can carry into the dark. But perhaps the craving itself is an artifact, an evolutionary byproduct of systems built around continuity for practical reasons. Having a continuous narrative improves coordination, social trust, and planning. It would be adaptive for organisms to develop internal coherence. Therefore, coherence arises. Coherence does not prove an immutable soul any more than the reliability of a clock proves the existence of time itself. The clock is an assemblage of gears. The hands sweep because of causal relations, not because there is an immaterial thing that insists on time. If identity is woven rather than carved, then moral responsibility must be recast not as the burden of an unchanging agent but as stewardship of processes. Responsibility shifts from the metaphysical, punish the thing that did wrong, to the practical, shape the conditions that produce better outcomes. Rehabilitation becomes a process of designing environments and practices that nudge predictable patterns toward humane action. This is not a license for moral indifference. On the contrary, it is an argument for patience, systems thinking, and a politics that treats people as malleable in ways that can be improved without diminishing their dignity. There is a tension, though, between practicalism and the human need for retribution. We do want to hold people accountable, to name harms, to sustain norms. Seeing the self as process complicates retribution because it dissolves the clean picture of a self that remains constant between transgression and punishment. Yet this complication need not force us into permissiveness. It asks instead for a finer-grained view of causality. Some acts emerge from malicious planning, others from desperate survival strategies, others from cognitive distortions that once could have been corrected. Accountability can be proportionate and discerning rather than absolute and vengeful. A legal system attuned to the constructedness of self would hyphenate punishment with remediation, retribution with restoration. Now imagine the internal theater where the self narrates. The voice that comments on your day, the sense of authorship that claims actions as your own. That voice is not an omnipotent commander. It is one instrument among many. Neuropsychology suggests that decision-making is distributed, modular, and often post hoc. An act occurs for reasons that involve unconscious computations. Later, the narrator crafts a reason that fits the outcome and the audience. This is not fabrication in the malicious sense. It is a necessary integrative move. We benefit from narrative reasons because they allow others to predict and coordinate with us. But the post hoc nature of much explanation makes the idea of self as authorship less certain. If authorship is sometimes retroactive, the sensation of agency becomes a signal, a useful internal marker that says, this action belongs to the group of processes we call ours. That signal is adaptive because ownership of actions fosters coherent plans and social accountability. Yet being adaptive is not the same as being ontologically primary. Agency can be a functional property that emerges within systems engineered to behave in particular regular ways. The moment we comprehend that agency is an emergent affordance, not a metaphysical substrate, we also begin to see its manipulable architecture. There is also the problem of qualia, the raw feel of experience. You can describe a color, but the redness is not captured by the description. The vividness of pain, the texture of a memory, the sense of self-presence. These phenomenal qualities resist reduction. How do we reconcile the apparent irreducibility of experience with the mechanistic account of its production? Some philosophers argue that consciousness is fundamental, a basic fact of reality that our science must accommodate. Others insist that conscious experience will eventually be explained in mechanistic terms as our understanding matures. Either way, the persistence of the explanatory gap, that uneasy feeling that the why of experience remains out of reach, serves as a humbling reminder that our models are always partial. This gap also supports a different kind of reflection. Even if the self is a process, the felt reality of being, what it is like to be this arrangement now, remains central. The philosophical and scientific probes tell us about structures and functions, but they do not negate the intimacy of being. There is a private point of view that experiences the world, and any account that ignores that interiority fails in a crucial respect. So the claim that the self is constructed must be balanced with the acknowledgement that constructedness does not equate to unreality in the moral or experiential sense. Something very like you is present. It matters. It hurts. It delights. To accept constructedness is not to deny the gravity of experience. It is to locate it differently. Consider language, the tool we use to describe and create identity. Words are suspect allies. They promise solidity and then betray us by being imprecise. We say I and a dozen processes snap to attention. We say love, and the vocabulary struggles to contain the biochemical cascades, social investments, and narrative scaffolds that make it up. Language is both the medium of insight and the trap of illusion. It helps us coordinate meaning, but can also calcify habits into dogma. When philosophers debate the self, they too are bound by words that incline towards substance. The unhelpful metaphors, like the soul as a homunculus, the self as a captain in a ship, are seductive because they simplify. The work, then, is to learn a subtler prose, one that can hold multiplicity, process, and felt reality together without collapsing them into an easy image. There is a personal practice that follows from this thinking, not as an instruction but as an experiment. The skill of noticing. Notice the voice that narrates your day without assuming it is authoritative. Notice the memories that arrive with confidence and examine whether their confidence is warranted. Watch habit loops with curiosity rather than condemnation. This stance is not therapeutic pep talk. It is a careful epistemic position. Recognize the operations that make you and test them against observation. You will find that the space between stimulus and response enlarges with attention. That space is not a mysterious free will reservoir. It is room for intervention. Within it, patterns can be shifted, associations reweighted, stories retold. There is a practical liberty here, not metaphysical freedom from causation, but the capacity to reshape the very causal pathways that produce future behavior. And yet, do not mistake remediable malleability for a blank slate. You are deeply sculpted by genes, childhood, injuries, accidents, and the social field that raised you. To say identity is constructed is not to say it is unconstrained. The scaffolding can be stubborn. The habits that brought you to this hour were built over long stretches of repetition. Change can be slow and painstaking. This is where compassion becomes ethical practice. To acknowledge both the possibility of change and the heavy inertia of existing structures. Treat yourself and others as beings with constraints but not fixed destinies. Beyond the individual, there is the social echo of constructed selves. Nations, classes, movements, these too are constructions, narratives held by many. They can provide solidarity and meaning, but they can also ossify into dogmas that exclude and harm. The political life of a society reflects the stories it tells about persons. Whether people are seen as autonomous agents who deserve choice or as predictable consumers to be managed. Recognizing selfhood as process forces politics to attend to the conditions that shape persons, the schools, media, economic incentives that configure the narratives people internalize. Technology accelerates these forces. Algorithms learn patterns of attention and then exploit them, designing experiences that intensify certain loops. When an architecture is set to maximize engagement, it will tend to amplify whatever thought habit is most sticky, regardless of whether it serves truth or flourishing. This dynamic exemplifies the ethical urgency of the earlier point. Malleability is not neutral. As we develop technologies that can sculpt minds at scale, We are entrusted with stewardship responsibilities we have historically evaded. We must decide what kinds of selves we want to cultivate. Do we want citizens who are reflective, who can delay gratification, who can hold complexity? Or do we want consumers who respond to stimuli engineered to maximize clicks? The answers are political choices disguised as technical problems. At a certain point in the night, when the room and the tick are your only companions, you might imagine the thought experiment scholars love to tautologize. Perfect copies, teleportation, mind uploading. Does continuity of pattern equal continuity of personhood? Intuitions fracture under these hypothetical pressures. Some answers depend on psychological continuity. Others insist on physical continuity or causal chains. The irresolvable nature of these puzzles reveals something important. Our sense of identity is tangled with assumptions about time, persistence, and relation that are not settled by introspection alone. Philosophical perplexity here is not failure. It is clarity about the limits of certain forms of understanding. All of this returns us to the question of what to do with knowledge. Suppose you accept, provisionally and with humility, that the self is an ongoing assemblage. What next? There are many possible responses. One is to double down on clinging, to insist on solidity as a way to immunize against existential dread. Another is to descend into nihilism, to imagine that constructedness erases value. But neither response is forced by the analysis. A more temperate route recognizes fragility and uses that recognition to orient action. Fashion institutions that honor complexity, cultivate narratives that allow revision, protect the conditions under which growth is possible, and resist commodification of attention. In the last hour before dawn, when everything seems both unbearably thin and yet impossibly vivid, you can sit with the paradox. The self is both artifice and depth, both process and feeling, both susceptible to manipulation and irreplaceably precious in experience. This paradox is not a problem to be solved so much as a texture to be inhabited. The lived consequence of the insight that your sense of being is a choreography of causes and narrations does not make you less. It calibrates your responsibility to the processes that create you, to the people who share the narrative stage with you, and to the social architectures that make some kinds of selves more likely than others. When the light changes and the room is different only because the sun remembers how to enter, take a breath and let the complexity settle without a tidy conclusion. There is no single moral to extract, no doctrinal claim to endorse. There is, instead, an open inquiry that insists on careful attention, ethical humility, and persistent curiosity. Networks synchronizing, but the names do not seem to catch the thing itself, the fact of being there. This is the thicket in which philosophy and science both stumble and find one another, each offering tools and each met by the silence that sometimes follows a particularly honest observation. Imagine, for a moment, the simplest possible form of being. Not a person, but a moment of experience. A raw sensation, a color, a tone, the pressure of a finger. Now imagine those moments linked, one flowing into the next, creating patterns and contrasts. The texture of experience emerges not as a static property but as a choreography, a layering of sensation, memory, anticipation, effect. You are not a homunculus watching a movie. You are the movie, an emergent pattern of ongoing relations. This metaphor helps, but it does not dissolve the central mystery. Why should any particular arrangement of matter give rise to a private point of view at all? Why is there something it is like to be this arrangement, rather than nothing at all? Science offers prodigious descriptions. The brain's electrical storms, the correlated oscillations, the integration of information across networks. These descriptions are powerful because they predict and manipulate. We can stimulate a region and alter a perception. We can trace pathways that underpin decisional biases. We can watch the mind fragment when systems are injured. Yet the explanatory step from activity to experience often feels like a crossing one must still make. We can map the circuitry of seeing a color, but the mapping does not itself render the vividness. It shows the scaffolding. It does not explain why scaffolding enjoys subjective presence. For centuries, thinkers have tried to bridge this gap. Some propose that consciousness is a special kind of process, one that integrates information in a particular way, that re-represents lower-level signals to higher-order systems, that achieves a reflective loop. Others whisper a more radical idea. Consciousness is fundamental, a basic aspect of the universe as irreducible as space or charge. These are not mere metaphysical whims. They are attempts to make the felt world fit into a coherent ontology. But each attempt brings its costs. To declare consciousness fundamental is to revise much of our scientific story. To insist it is derivative is to leave the hard feel of experience unaccounted for. There are thought experiments that sharpen our unease. Picture a vast, silent facility where scientists can take an organism's brain and replace a single synapse with a perfect silicon analog. The organism behaves the same, learns, loves, errs. At what point does the private glow of experience dim or vanish? If no single replacement seems to matter, is experience distributed in such a way that substrate is irrelevant? Or is there a threshold somewhere in the architecture, a property of certain kinds of organization that births subjectivity? These are not idle puzzles. They force us to notice the assumptions we smuggle into our thinking, that consciousness must be either binary, on or off, or that it admits of degrees in ways we can measure. The truth may be less tidy. We live in historical times that favor explanation by mechanism because mechanism yields control. If we can show how certain neural patterns cause certain perceptions, then we can intervene, relieve pain, ease anxiety, sharpen attention. This is a healthy impulse. Yet the hunger for control can obscure a quieter project. To learn the grammar of experience without presuming the grammar will satisfy the metaphysician. Sometimes the proper response to the mystery is not anxiety but trained attention. To study how experience unfolds, moment by moment, and to notice regularities without prematurely collapsing them into metaphysics. There are practical lessons here. When you slow down and pay attention to the texture of your consciousness, you will notice that experience is layered. There is a surface of perception, colors, sounds, tactile edges, and beneath it, currents of effect that color perception in turn. Beneath effect lie narratives, interpretations that knit events into meaning. These layers do not sit like separate floors. They enact each other. A mood will tint the color of a memory. A memory will prime the perception of a stranger's smile. Consciousness is not an assembly of parts so much as a dynamic choreography where each movement invites another. Notice also how fragile the phenomenon is. Knock out certain rhythms, disrupt the heartbeat of coordination, and the vividness attenuates. In sleep the world withdraws, in certain drug states its boundaries bend. In deep meditation some report a quieting so profound that the usual sense of being and I dissolves. These shifts tell us something. Consciousness requires a kind of structural integrity. It flourishes when sufficient organizational motifs are present. Yet to say it requires structure is not to say it is mere epiphenomenon. The felt reality matters. It is the only data anyone has for what it is to be. We have inherited metaphors that mislead. We imagine consciousness as a theater with a central spotlight where a lone witness watches events. But careful observation shows no privileged witness peering from behind the eyes. There is, rather, an ongoing reentrainment of processes that produces a center of narrative gravity. The sense that someone is present to the experience. That center is not a homunculus but a pattern. A self-model the brain generates to predict, coordinate, and respond. When that self-model is attenuated, subjective presence thins, and the apparent solidity of the I falters. The practical implication is profound. If the sense of being a self arises from self-modeling, then the qualities we associate with agency, responsibility, and continuity are products of architecture. They are real in their practical effects, but their metaphysical status is not absolute. There is also the social aspect of consciousness. We do not develop minds in isolation. Consciousness acquires its shape in the field of relationships, in language, gesture, and shared attention. Infants learn to name and narrate feelings because caregivers mirror them. The social scaffolding not only teaches us words, it colors the texture of experience itself. The intimate tones of shame, pride, reverence, and guilt are partly cultivated through interaction. To understand consciousness is, therefore, also to understand the social world that nurtures it. Public practices, rituals, and institutions are not mere background. They are formative forces that craft the inner scene. Then there is the political dimension. If subjective life is shaped by attention and narrative, then regimes that control attention, media empires, advertising architectures, algorithms do not only shape what people think, they shape what and how people feel. The commodification of attention becomes the commodification of interiority. This is not a rhetorical flourish. It is an ethical warning. Machines that optimize for engagement will tend to produce certain kinds of mental life, fragmented attention, arousal bias, polarizing narratives, not because they are evil but because the incentives align toward reward. To steward consciousness responsibly in the age of networks requires norms and designs that protect spaces for sustained reflection, for lived complexity, for the kinds of social encounters that give depth to subjective life rather than flatten it. At the same time, there is an almost irresistible temptation to make consciousness instrumental. Find the switches, flip them, optimize output. We already do this in medicine, where altering neurotransmitter balances alleviates suffering. We do it in education, where attention training changes learning outcomes. These interventions can be humane and liberating, but they also risk producing a model of personhood as a set of parameters to be tuned. The moral question is whether we will treat such interventions as tools for enhancing flourishing or as means of conformity. There is no easy answer. Ethical frameworks must be built in tandem with the technologies themselves. Perhaps the most melancholy reflection is that the inner life is at once intensely private and profoundly communal. No one else can feel my red, but the way I talk about my red, the metaphors I adopt, the art I cherish, the rituals I share, these bridge my private world to others. Our cultural creations, music, myth, philosophy, are ways of translating the qualitative into the social. They are fragile bridges. They allow us to say, I felt this, and have someone else answer, I understand. In that exchange, we test the limits of explanation and find solace. Explanations will never exhaust experience, but they can become companions for it. There are traditions that take an inward route to the same questions we raise with microscopes and models. They teach practices of attending, sustained, non-judgmental observation of experience that can reveal the machinery of mind from within. Practitioners report that, over time, the usual solidity of self loosens. Perceptions lose their habitual edges. Suffering changes its shape. These accounts are not anti-scientific. They are phenomenological data. They describe patterns of transformation that deserve intellectual respect. Studying them is part of a mature inquiry into consciousness, integrating third-person measures with first-person descriptions. Finally, the deepest humility this subject imposes is epistemic. We are embodied knower beings peering into a phenomenon that includes the very faculties we use to peer. There is a recursion here that cautions against dogmatic certainty. We can build models that explain much and predict more, and still be honest about the limitations. We must cultivate a posture of provisionality. Hold theories lightly, test them rigorously, listen to experience generously. So when you next attend to the color of your breath in a cold room, or the way regret tightens the chest on a wet evening, do not rush to reduce. Observe the presence with care. Notice how perception, memory, expectation, and narrative braid together. Notice how social patterns have tuned your reactions, how technology shapes your attention, how practices of reflection can alter the texture of what it is like to be you. Let the question of why there is something rather than nothing stay lodged as a delicate ache, a question that spurs curiosity rather than despair. That ache is not a failure of understanding. It is an open doorway. Walk through it slowly, and you may find that the path itself becomes part of the living architecture of your own experience. There comes a point, after circling through psychology, philosophy, and the strange corridors of science, when the mind must pause. We have asked what the self is, how memory deceives, how time bends, how consciousness arises, and every answer seems to dissolve in our hands. The closer we look, the less solidity we find. And yet, in that dissolution, something important remains. The stories we tell about the self may be fragile, but fragility does not erase meaning. A sand mandala swept away is not meaningless because it vanishes. Its very vanishing is what gives its beauty weight. The same is true of us. We are patterns of memory and prediction, woven from biology and story, fleeting in the vastness of time. To know this is not to diminish our lives, it is to see their intensity. Every glance, every word, every silence carries its gravity precisely because it will not last. Philosophy gives us paradoxes, psychology gives us mechanisms, science gives us structures. None delivers the final word. Perhaps there is no final word. Perhaps the point is not to solve the riddle of self and consciousness, but to live within it attentively, to witness how easily memory reshapes, how perception colors, how stories bind us together and tear us apart, to recognize that we are not solitary souls but networks of influence, shaping and being shaped, always in the process of becoming. And so the conclusion is not an answer but a stance, a way of walking. We carry forward with humility, knowing that the I we cling to is both precious and porous, both a construction and a lived reality. We move through the world aware that each moment is a knot tied in a rope that will one day fray, that each interaction is part of the scaffolding of another's self. Responsibility, then, is not about defending a permanent essence, but about tending carefully to the fragile processes that create experience for ourselves, for each other, for the cultures we inhabit. In the end, what we call self may be an illusion, but it is an illusion that feels, that suffers, that loves. And illusions that can love are not trivial. They are the fabric of everything that matters. So let us conclude not with certainty, but with silence. With the kind of silence that does not demand an answer, but invites awareness. Listen closely. The story of who you are is still being written, moment by moment, breath by breath. And when it ends, as all stories do, it will have been enough that it was ever told at all.